Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hi, and welcome to Self-Improvement Atlas, the Personal Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm Marie Stella, your host from Melbourne, Australia. Let's start the show. Welcome back to Self-Improvement Atlas, the Personal Science Insights podcast. In this rapidly changing economic landscape, navigating financial waters can feel daunting very often, but be daunted not, for we are speaking to Professor Richard Holden today to get a better grasp on money in the 21st century. Richard is an economics professor at the University of New South Wales Business School, but outside of the classroom, he's also the director of the Economics of Education Knowledge Hub and co-director of the New Economic Policy Initiative. Hi, Richard. It's lovely to have you on the show. How are you going?
I'm well. Great to be with you.
Yeah, so before we begin, I'm really curious to know what's the most common misconception that you've heard about money in the 21st century?
I think there are two, actually. I think one is that cash in its kind of physical form is going to exist, 5, 10, 15 years from now, well into the century. And I don't think that's going to be the case at all. And I think the second is that digital money, so I'm thinking here of cryptocurrencies or central bank digital currencies, are basically just the same as being able to use a debit card or a credit card, when in fact they're much more than that they can be something that can power Web3 and smart contracts and programmable money. And so I think there's a lot more functionality there. So that'd be the two most common misconceptions, I think.
Yeah. That certainly is news for me, especially the first one. It's not that I ever thought, it's not that I really thought much about it, which is why I probably just envisioned the future being like, okay, we have $5 in PayPal right now. But that's a great introduction to our topic for today. I'm excited to go further into detail. But before that, we like to get to know you better. This is Have You Met Richard? And my first question for you is, what do you like to do in your spare time?
I mainly like to cook and play golf and hang out with my kids. And so usually I can't combine cooking and playing golf, but I can combine those two things with hanging out with my kids.
For sure. So what do you like to cook? Are there dishes of yours that your children keep asking for?
It's kind of all across the map in a way. Being Australian born and bred, even though I lived in the US for 10 years, kind of modern Australian cooking with a lot of Asian influences is, something that I love and like to do all the time. The most interesting development in the last 18 months or so is making ice cream and sorbet with a thing called the Ninja. So there's a good story behind this. So there's a device that costs about $10,000 that professional chefs use called a pacojet. You basically make ice cream or sorbet and you freeze it for 24 hours. And this thing is like the world's most powerful, small, high-speed blender. And it just the pacojet just turns that into the most perfectly textured ice cream you've ever had. Turns out there was a patent for that. You could have a patent for 17 years. It went off patent. And these folks at Ninja, who make these quite affordable kitchen appliances, produced a version of that. And the patent tells you how to make it, right? For $300.
Wow.
And I had a chef friend who had a pacojet when I lived in here. So I've used a pacojet.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that the Ninja is exactly as good. And it costs $300. So I now have this technology where I make, for a small window, I make impossibly good ice cream and sorbet. So that's popular in my household.
That is so cool. What kind of flavors do you make? Are you experimental with them or do you tend to go for the classics?
Both, but vanilla bean ice cream is a classic, made with proper vanilla beans, hard to go past. And then in terms of sorbet, mango yuzu is the current house favorite.
Oh, those sounds so incredible. I love anything with yuzu in it. And vanilla bean is it happens to be my favorite flavor of ice cream of all time. Not just vanilla, it has to be vanilla bean because it just hits different.
Absolutely, you got to see the little bits of vanilla bean in there,
Yes.
otherwise it's not the real deal.
I know. The flavor is just so much more impeccable and you get to taste the little bits of vanilla bean as well, which makes it so luxurious. I love that so much. What's the most experimental flavor that you've done?
My son was very keen on making a roasted peach, and then straining the skins through a strainer. And so we did sort of roasted peach with a little bit of yuzu as well. Yuzu is sort of a common theme. So that was pretty good. And I've tried some of the crazy ice cream flavors like Heston Blumenthal's bacon and egg ice cream. So that's out there, but that's just a knockoff of someone
Yeah.
genuinely creative.
Yeah. Was the bacon and egg one genuinely good?
I got to say, I don't think it was, but I've also had it at Heston Blumenthal's restaurant, and it was the only thing there that I didn't really like either. So that's probably
Mhm.
says something about the unsophistication of my palate more than anything else.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the flavor itself that you don't like and not a testament to your cooking at all. You know what? I'd be really keen to try if I had this machine is I've been really wanting this flavor for a really long time, and that's brown butter miso with honey bacon.
Okay, that sounds pretty cool. I'll put that on my list.
Please tell me if you do try it. You did mention that you are into golf.
Yeah.
What is it about golf that you like?
Um, well, one good thing is it's you're allowed to be bad at it, and that's like a commonly accepted thing. I used to
Yeah.
play a lot in my misspent youth, so I used to be like okay. Now I'm really not. I, there's something a little bit zen about like when you make perfect contact with a golf ball, and the fact that there's a little bit of strategy involved in it. So the kind of economist and game theorist in me kind of quite likes that too.
Yeah, and I imagine like the spanning greens when you go and play golf as well can be really tranquil almost. Um, and yeah, I don't think that's a misspent youth at all. I think you spent your youth perfectly fine. Like that sounds like a great way to spend your youth.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
my
what else?
story, and I'm going
Yeah.
to stick to that. But
So, in your life, are there any people that you look up to?
yeah, there are lots of people I look up to. But in terms of my professional life, I got to say, Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary of the United States, is probably at the top of the list. And I was very fortunate when I was in grad school doing my PhD at Harvard. I ended up being Larry's teaching assistant for a course he taught to 15 first-year undergrads in a freshman seminar. So I got to spend 3 hours a week for a term with Larry up close and see how his mind worked. And his contribution to academic economics is extraordinary, but also his contribution to public policy over many decades, I think, has been pretty remarkable. And so he's definitely someone I look up to.
That's amazing. What traits of his do you admire?
Um, I think two things. One, he's an incredibly quick thinker on his feet. So he can get confronted with a question he hasn't really thought about, and he'll figure out what he thinks about it from first principles very quickly. I
Yeah.
think the other thing is, he's willing to change his mind when the data changes and, admit when he's wrong. And I think it takes a degree of being pretty intellectually comfortable with yourself to be able to say, yeah, I messed up on that one. I changed my mind now.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I think I'm still not so good at that myself, but that's something I aspire to for sure.
Oh yeah, 100%. I feel like it takes a level of intelligence to have that humility as well. And when you have that intelligence and you know your intelligence, but you also have that humility, that's all the more admirable. So that's he sounds like a great role model for you. Thank you so much for sharing with us a bit more about yourself. I feel like we got to know you a bit better. Now we'll move on to the interview section. And my first question for you is, how would you define personal development?
I would say personal development is making better choices over time as one, gets more life experience, and being kind of at peace with those choices. So I think for me, at
Yeah.
least, I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask about that, to be honest. But I think that's at least how I think about it and what I aspire
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, well, personal development, there's a wide range of opinions about it and different views and perspectives on it. But in your personal opinion, how do you think financial literacy ties into our personal development?
Well, I think financial literacy is an incredibly important thing, and it can really affect our not only our life choices but our life outcomes, really. And it's not something that comes easily to a lot of people. Much to my chagrin, I've got to say, is it's not really something that's taught very much in school. There's some moves to improve that, and I think that would be a good thing, some curriculum changes and some more emphasis being put on that. But for a lot of people, if they're not interested in economics or finance, mathematics, or some combination of those things, it's not something that sort of comes naturally to people, and it can really lead them to make less than stellar choices. It also opens them up to being vulnerable to scam artists and people who want to pull one over on them. And of course, regulators have a role to play in trying to crack down on that kind of stuff. But there's no better defense against that stuff than having a good antennae for a scam yourself. So I think it's incredibly important, and it's something that really affects what happens to all of us. Whether we're going to own a home or not, whether we're going to plan for our retirement or not, whether we're going to be able to do things for our kids or loved ones or not. It's incredibly important.
Yeah, for sure. And the way I see it, learning about financial literacy is learning something new, and learning something new is always going to lead to personal growth. So that in itself is very much a huge integral part of personal development. But how do you think understanding the concept of money in the 21st century, in particular, can support our financial literacy?
Well, I think that anytime the kind of landscape is changing a lot, it's important to understand, what's happening and how to adapt to that. Now, in terms of, how I see money changing, I mean, one aspect of it, so in my book, I talk about three aspects of it. Money in the 21st century as being cheap, mobile, and digital. So the cheap aspect is that interest rates, although interest rates have gone up recently in Australia and around advanced economies, interest rates are still very low compared to historical levels. And for a long time after the 2008 financial crisis, interest rates were really very close to zero, or in some parts of Europe were actually negative. And we're probably not headed back to zero anytime soon. But, there's talk about the Reserve Bank maybe cutting interest rates late this year or next year. Historically, if we end up with official interest rates at 3.5% or something, that's a historically very low level. That changes the balance between how good it is to be a borrower or a lender. And the cheaper that interest rates are, the more attractive it is to be a borrower, and the less attractive it is to be a lender, all else equal. Now, borrowing money and spending it on fancy clothes or vacations or trinkets, isn't a great use of the money, but it opens up the possibility that people who've got really productive ideas, but not a lot of capital, can get funding to try and develop and further those ideas. So I think that's pretty important for thinking about what the opportunities are for young people in particular, but all of us going forward. And I think, in terms of it being mobile, I'm thinking here of tap cards and Apple Pay and Google Pay and things like that. That's really just going to change our day-to-day life and convenience. It already has in many ways. It's just that 10 years from now, you won't have to stand behind some annoying person in a line at a coffee shop counting out 10-cent coins and stuff. So that'll speed everything up a little bit, but I'm not sure how much it'll change our personal development.
Yeah.
It'll make me a less frustrated person from time to time, but I'm not sure if that counts. And then in terms of it being digital, I think this is where, there's a big thing on the horizon, which is central bank digital currencies, programmable money that can sort of only turn on or turn off based on certain circumstances or events occurring. We've already seen decentralized finance playing a bigger and bigger role in our lives, and I think that's going to lead to a really, really interesting future and a lot of financial innovation that could really change people's lives and hence their own kind of personal development.
That's really interesting. So, could you go further into detail about how the concept of money in this century compares to the previous generations?
Yeah, so I mean, for a really long time, from you know, uh, you know, well BCE, if you like, money didn't really change very much. We started out with money being, to do with maybe metals and coins and things like that. And, it starts off with shekels and develops over time. And, throughout the first two millennia of the current period, you see it really change very little. You end up with paper money and things like that. But basically, it doesn't change very much. Sometimes it's backed by gold. Sometimes it's not. The gold standard came and went. It didn't functionally change very much. And then, in 2008, three things happened all at once. So firstly, with the 2008 financial crisis, it led to interest rates going down a lot and staying low for a long period of time. So that's the sort of advent of cheap money. Also in 2008, the iPhone 3G launches, and you suddenly have the possibility of mobile money, and that the development of apps, of course, and the development of Apple Pay and other payment technologies, Venmo, all these sorts of things suddenly becomes a reality. And you also have the Bitcoin white paper that year, and so it's also the birth of digital money, cryptocurrency, in that year. So for a long time, it didn't really change at all. And then in 2008, at least the basis for it changing a lot, happened kind of all at once. And you've seen since then a lot of changes. People don't pay for very much stuff with cash anymore in countries with advanced payment systems like Australia or Sweden or places like that. Just to prove a point, when I started talking in 2016 or 2017 about how Australia could go cashless, just to make a point, I didn't pay for anything with cash for a year. And, that was just not very hard at all. And, it's easy for a lot of people to do, some more than others. And, for older Australians, it may be harder, and we should be mindful of that and sensitive to that. But, things have changed in a big way in terms of what money is, how convenient it is, and what it can do. And that's all happened in the last 15 years.
So you did mention a bit before about how there's so many financial opportunities that are changing dependent on what the situation is. Could you go a bit more into that, especially in the 21st century? What financial opportunities or challenges are more apparent to us now as a result of globalization and technological advances as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing is moving money around the world. Now, people have wanted to move money around the world and into different currencies for a really long time. It's pretty amazing to me that it still more or less takes 3 to 5 days to send money from, a highly creditable bank in Australia to a highly creditable bank in the United States. And you pay a pretty expensive fee. It's done in terms of the spread. They might only charge you $20 to transfer thousands of dollars, but, you don't get a very sharp exchange rate when you do that. As anyone, it's not so much better than going to an airport when you're about to go on holiday and exchanging it at the counter at the airport. And so it takes a long time, and it's expensive one way or the other. To do that, I talk about this in the book. There's a pilot program between a number of central banks at the moment where they're using blockchain technology to be able to transfer money from, say, Australia to the US, but it could really be anywhere, in a matter of seconds rather than in a matter of days. And it's kind of really weird that at the moment it literally depends on, like, is one bank or the receiving bank, and it usually goes through many, many steps, maybe 10 or a dozen steps. On each one of those legs or each one of those steps, is the bank like open at the same time, or do you have to wait to the next day? And of course, when you're moving around the world, time zones differ and so on. That's why it can take 3 to 5 days. They've really now cracked the case on how to be able to do that in, less than a second. And they've cracked the problem of the fact that you don't want to send money sort of out of your account and give it to somebody else until there's kind of acknowledgement of the receipt of that. And so that's just a basic problem. Now, we deal with that problem every day, which is when I bought a coffee just before we started chatting, I tapped my card and it was 2 minutes later that I got my macchiato, but I trusted the coffee shop that they were going to pay, and there are social norms around that. There's reputation. If they start pocketing $4 and stop giving out the coffees, then they're not going to be in business very long. And, in principle, I could have called the cops if they didn't do that. But, in a whole lot of exchanges, firstly in countries with less developed rule of law, and in the ones that I'm talking about, you send $1 billion, well, if you send me $1 billion and I'm, even a reasonably reputable financial institution, I start thinking, well, what's my reputation worth? $1 billion, maybe not $10 billion. I don't know, maybe. And so being able to solve this kind of chicken and egg problem is really important. And there's a thing in blockchain technology or in decentralized finance called an atomic swap, which basically deals with that. It sort of says, I'm going to send you the money, but it won't get activated as being actually sent and usable until you send me a receipt. And so as a result of that, we can basically, it's like a time delay switch, and we can program that into money so it solves that problem. Now, that's going to make it easier to send money around the world. It's also going to make it cheaper to send money around the world. It's going to make it faster to send money around the world. That same idea, though, once you start thinking about it, you say, I wonder how many exchanges, economic exchanges, how many spot transactions in countries without great social norms or without a very developed rule of law, what economic activity, what spot transactions aren't happening because I don't trust the counterparty. Well, if I can suddenly do that with programmable money, I don't know, maybe there's a whole lot of economic development that could take place in a whole bunch of countries. So I think that's the kind of thing that I look at and say, wow, programmable money is a really exciting opportunity in a whole range of contexts, both highly developed countries and in somewhat less developed countries. And then there's smart contracts, which is really the idea of writing a financial contract, but in computer code. And once you can do that, you can basically commit to do things that you might want to renege on after you get more information. And so the ability to sort of tie my hands to the mast in the classic telling of it, to commit to do something means that you know how I'm going to act, and that can lead to better things happening between us. You know that I'm not going to mess you around because I've committed not to do that. That commitment power can be hugely important for individuals contracting, for governments. And so smart contracts, which can only work if they're powered by digital currency. Right now, they're powered by things like Ethereum or Ether, but on the Ethereum blockchain. I think in future, they're going to be powered by central bank digital currencies. And those smart contracts are going to be hugely important to a whole range of economic activity.
And how should or are individuals able to take advantage of all this?
So right now, it's pretty hard for individuals to take advantage of it. If you're reasonably sophisticated and you know how to write Solidity code on the Ethereum blockchain, and you have gone through an exchange and you've got Ether, then you can write smart contracts. But that's, not super user-friendly. But I think once we're in a world of central bank digital currencies, when there's a digital US dollar, there's already a digital yuan in China, And that's really expanding very rapidly when there's a digital Australian dollar and a digital pound and a digital euro. All these things are coming soon enough, whether it's 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, who knows, but it's coming soon to a digital wallet near you. And once we're in that world, there'll be a huge app ecosystem, which springs up very quickly to help individual people do those kinds of things. So there'll be like off-the-shelf smart contracting technologies. There'll be apps that allow you to send money from one currency to another on a peer-to-peer basis or an individual-to-individual basis. So this stuff will all, I think, become a lot more user-friendly as soon as the kind of backbone technology, which is the central bank digital currency, is there.
That's really interesting, but it also, at the same time, for someone who isn't into finance and economics, sounds very foreign to me. So, what advice do you have, or like, what do you think people need to prepare for with all of this coming?
I don't think they need to do too much. So, one thing is, I think if you'd said to a lot of people 20 years ago, so let's cast our minds back to, say to 2004, 20, 30 years ago, anywhere between 1994 and 2000, 2004 will do well enough. It's pre-smartphone. So if I told you that if you go out for a morning jog and you want to buy a coffee on the way back or get breakfast at the end of it, that you wouldn't need to take your wallet or any cash with you. And in fact, the device, your watch, that you track your workout on would also allow you to just tap and pay for your coffee or your breakfast or whatever. I think you would have been you would have called me like the nice version would have been to call me a futurist, and the less nice version would have been to call me like totally nuts, right? and yet here we are, and that's been possible for like 10 years, right?
Yeah.
And so things change pretty rapidly. No one had to prepare for that. I mean, Steve Jobs had to prepare for that, right? The banking system had to prepare for that, but you and I didn't need to prepare for that. And I think the same thing will happen here. It'll come to us. And part of what's useful about it is this stuff has to be user-friendly, otherwise people won't adopt it. And so I think that the providers of these services and technologies, both hardware and software, have gotten really good at making these things user-friendly because they know that if they're not, they lose. And, Nokia was not a very user-friendly phone. You may be too young to have had a Nokia phone. I'm old enough to have.
I had Nokia. I had Nokia.
I had a Nokia phone, and I always got the newest, fanciest Nokia phone. I thought it was so advanced. And then
I just had the old one.
If you look at that now, and this was, you'd think it was Stone Age type technology compared to the iPhone. And I remember actually a Nokia board member explaining to me in 2008, it was, why Nokia was in trouble. And they did a very simple explanation of it. They said, add this person's number so I had an iPhone. Add this person's number, like contact number, to your phone. And I did it. And they said, now add it to my Nokia. They were a Nokia board member. They had to have a Nokia phone, right? Yeah. Right. And doing it in my iPhone took like a few seconds and 2 steps or something. And doing it in Nokia, right? So like you had to go through a 3 scroll down menu, you had to go to the right place, scroll down, and then type it in with the 3, it's like ABC, and you had to hit it 3 times to get a C, and then you had to wait, and then and it took like 100 steps and 3 minutes, and it was like, and this person said to me, that's why Apple's going to cut our lunch, basically. And they were right. So, what's the moral of that story? Nokia lost to Apple for a variety of reasons, but one is they had a crappy user interface and a crappy experience for customers. And Apple had a better one, and they won. And so I think we don't have to prepare too much. It's going to come to us.
Yeah. That's a really good way of putting it. I just have like personal qualms and fears about growing old and not being able to adapt to new things that are coming and not being able to understand it. But I feel like maybe that's an issue that I'll face maybe in 50 years time. And I might be worrying about it too soon. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, make sure you have kids and grandkids. That's one
To teach
strategy to
me.
deal with that, to keep you young
Yeah.
and be able to.
To be
It's the equivalent.
obliged.
It's the equivalent of when I used to program people's VCRs for them. If you can remember those days.
Yeah.
Um, no, I think I think there's a serious side and a flippant side to it, and I think that the serious side's twofold. One is that technology's gotten a lot better and a lot more user friendly along the lines that we just discussed. I think the second thing is that there's very understandable fear in parts of the community about things like going cashless. And when I talk about it, one of the very understandable pushbacks that I get is people saying, look, I'm 75 years old and I'm not that technologically sophisticated. And cash, I understand. And so when I see ATMs kind of like going away, I get freaked out. And I understand that. And that's a very understandable reaction. I think a lot of it is about making sure that we provide access to people. And a lot of it is about helping people make a transition to something that is better and inevitable. One of the examples I often give, it sounds a bit silly, but it's very real, which is if you're an older Australian with, somewhat limited mobility, perhaps, getting a couple $100 out of an ATM, and you don't want to go to the ATM like all the time because it's kind of a trek, right?
Yeah.
So you want to get like a decent amount of money out when you do it. Getting a couple of $100 out, that makes you pretty vulnerable, actually. And so unfortunately there's a risk aspect to that, and various other aspects to it. One of the great things in Australia that we don't have to worry about that places like the United States do have to worry about is financial inclusion at the level of thinking. In the United States, you have to actually ask the question, who does and doesn't have a bank account? We don't have to ask that question in Australia, right? Everyone has a bank account. Yeah. So we have the scaffolding for people to be digitally included in all these exciting new things. Now, there are not going to be so many octogenarians who are doing atomic swaps and are thinking about decentralized finance and stuff. They don't need to, but they are going to be able to be included in things like a cashless society. But we need to make sure that happens, and we need to make sure that people are brought along on the journey and are not left behind.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And in the context of the economic dynamics of today, what do you think the relationship is between career choices, education, and financial success?
Well, I think, there's an overarching point in economics. So let me start with the broadest possible thing in a way, which is basically people get paid according to how the market values their skill. Now, that's a little bit different in things the government pays for. So, nurses and school teachers and emergency services workers have amazing skills, but because the government pays for them, they're sometimes and, oftentimes, sadly, not valued because it's not really a marketplace that's valuing them. But in the market, for better or worse, we roughly get paid according to our skill. And in a world where technology and automation are becoming more and more of a thing, so we saw one wave of it, which is, robots and physical machinery on assembly lines and so on, displacing manual labor, and those skills going away and people needing to transition. In the world of an artificial intelligence revolution, which we're living through the early phases of at the moment, skills and having the right sort of skills are going to be more and more important than ever. And having skills that are complementary with technology rather than skills that can be substituted for by technology is going to be more and more important. So some skills that people have at the moment, we've already seen GPT-4, Gemini Advanced, Claude 3, can really just do those things better than some skills that over time have been very valuable and people have got paid very well for. On the other hand, there are a lot of creative people, there are a lot of technical people, there are a lot of people in the sciences and the social sciences, broadly speaking, who have skills that go very well together with technology. Their skills are going to become even more valuable. And the example I always like to give, just one of many, but is surgical robots. So Da Vinci surgical robots, you might think would make surgeons kind of, irrelevant or put a lot of surgeons out of work. Turns out that the combination of highly, highly trained surgeons with these Da Vinci surgical robots, and I encourage your listeners just to look it up, just Google it, and you'll be amazed at what these things can do. That has actually allowed for surgeries that can be more precise, that can have higher success rates and lower fatality rates, and also much, much shorter recovery times, because things like incisions can be much smaller, creating less scar tissue. And it turns out, rather than making surgeons irrelevant, it's made surgeons more relevant than ever, because it's allowed them to do things that robots can't do by themselves and human surgeons couldn't do by themselves. So I think it's all about thinking about how can I develop skills that are going to be complementary with technology, that are going to go well with technology.
Right.
And I think
Right.
that's the future of how people are going to be rewarded. And money and the medium of exchange is important for a lot of things. I wrote a whole book about that, but that's a kind of background phenomenon compared to our human capital development, as economists would call it.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of like what we've been doing this whole time, where people, even without technology, people have had to go for courses to update their skills in whatever field they're in, once in a while, every year, every 2 years, stuff like that. And uh, with this case, it's more of just like AI is added into it or technologies added into it, and you've got to learn to adapt to that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, who knew even a year ago that there would be a thing called prompt engineering and it would be a really valuable skill? So what you type in to ChatGPT, is really important as to what answer you get. And when you type something in, then the follow-up prompt that you give it is really important. And, we've probably all played around, but I've seen what people who are really good at writing prompts or in the current vernacular who are good prompt engineers, they get a lot more out of the technology than people who are not so good at that. And so, who knew that would be a skill? A year ago, it probably wasn't even in the dictionary. And now it's actually a super valuable skill. So, this stuff's evolving at a very rapid rate.
100%. I can personally vouch for that. I don't know how to write prompts for AI at all. I'm a trained writer. I publish and everything, but I have no idea how prompt writing works. And I don't know how people do it. And I've tried looking it up, and it's still like a work in progress kind of thing. It very much is a skill that we didn't realize that we needed. Even like before last year. So that's a very good point you make. But overall, in this day and age, what do you think some psychological aspects of money people should be aware of?
Well, I think there's one of the things that's been really well documented by economists and psychologists, actually oftentimes working together, has been some of the systematic biases that we fall prey to. So Daniel Kahneman, who's a psychologist at Princeton, won the Nobel Prize for this some years ago. And then Richard Thaler, Dick Thaler, who's an economist at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, somewhat more recently also won a Nobel Prize for what's become known as the field of behavioral economics. And really there, it's about understanding our human cognitive limitations, that we're, in the language of another Nobel Prize winner from long ago, Herbert Simon, who said we're intendedly rational beings, but boundedly so. And understanding that we're imperfect kind of computing machines or cognitive machines, I think is really important. That applies to what we do with money, how we make or lose money, but understanding that we sometimes don't update our beliefs about the world in the most fully rational way. So, statisticians and economists have a way of thinking about that. They say, if you have some view of the world, Bayesians will call it a prior belief about the world, and you get some new information and you update about that, you want to do it according to, an idea that's been around for centuries called Bayes' rule. Now, people, aren't going to do that mechanically. Some people are better or worse at doing that kind of intuitively. And so understanding that we sometimes make mistakes, we sometimes suffer from, so Dick Thaler, who I mentioned, famously coined the term base rate neglect, that we sometimes don't think about what the prevalence of, say, a disease in the population or the likelihood of something occurring is when we process that information. So understanding that we're imperfect and trying to learn to do better and understand what our own biases are. And some people are more subject to certain kinds of biases than others. And trying to sort of reprogram ourselves is really important. A classic one is what's known as the sunk cost fallacy. So, if you paid $20 to go to a movie, and it's a 2-hour movie, and you're 20 minutes in, and you realize this movie sucks, right? This is horrible. What should you do, right? And the answer is you should walk out, right? Because it's 1 hour, 40 minutes left of your life that you're never going to get back. At that point in time, your decision is, do I waste an hour and 40 minutes of my life or not, right? The $20 you paid and the 20 minutes that you've sunk into it, that is gone. That's water under the bridge. What do a lot of people do? Maybe most people do. They stay and they say, I don't want to waste the $20. But you've already wasted the $20. That's gone.
Yeah.
That's why it's called a sunk cost.
Right.
Now, it turns out a lot of us just don't think the right way about that stuff. So reprogramming ourselves to try and not suffer from these systematic biases is super important to making good decisions.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm probably one of those people that does fall prey to the sunk cost fallacy, in the sense of like, oh my God, I have to make use of all the money that I've just spent. But I might be better off just finding something else more entertaining to do, or something that I would find more enjoyable. And that's like at least I wouldn't be suffering in the movie theater.
Exactly. So try and be forward. We've all got to try and be forward looking. Think about where we are. Let's think about the future. And it's really hard to do.
Yeah, that is such great advice. Before we end off this section, do you have any last pieces of advice or words of wisdom to share with us with regards to cultivating healthy attitudes and behaviors towards money?
Wisdom or words of advice don't sound like things that I'm particularly good at dishing out. But I think this idea of kind of constantly trying to, think about how we can do a bit better, thinking about one's life experience in terms of making choices as a journey and trying to make progress, and to an extent, kind of trying to reinvent ourselves. So I like the Bob Dylan line or aphorism that he who is not busy being born is busy dying. I think those are words to live by. So if we can put a little bit of Bob Dylan into all of us, we'd probably be better decision makers.
Mm-hmm. Reinventing is so fun. It is such like not everyone has the luxury of time to do it, I guess, but it is fun if you can.
Hey, pop stars and movie stars do it all the time. Why can't we have a go at it as well, right?
Yeah, the eras, Taylor Swift, reinventing all the time. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's been such a fun talk. Now we're moving on to the questions from the audience section. And our question is, what is your opinion on Australia becoming a cashless society? Are bank tap and go rates a point of concern at all?
So, we are, pretty far down the path of becoming a cashless society. In some small amount of time, 2-3 years, we're going to be kind of functionally cashless, like hardly anyone's going to use cash. It's harder and harder to get cash. Now that's caused a bunch of people some angst and concerns. But these are big kind of global and technological forces. Trying to resist this is like kind of push on the ocean. It's not going to get very far. So, I understand why people say, well, I don't like this, and we should be thoughtful about the transition. And, we already talked about the idea that it's really important to make sure that all Australians are financially included, including older Australians. But like complaining about the fact that technology is getting rid of cash is like complaining about gravity. Like you can complain if you want, but it's still going to apply to you. And so, I think that we need to think about how to just embrace that. So yeah, there are concerns along the transition path, but it's happening, and we just need to get behind that and try and see the positives in it. It's a lot more efficient, and it's more efficient for cafes not to have to spend half an hour at the end of the day bundling up cash and coins and walking them up to a bank night safe, paying for insurance in case they get robbed, having a float in the morning, all those sorts of things. So there are a lot of efficiencies that come with it as well.
Yeah, I do have a like to the point of seeing the positive sides in it in going cashless. I did always have a bone to pick with whoever made the Australian coins because they are really, really heavy.
They are heavy.
They are
Yeah.
like the heaviest coins I've ever carried, and getting just $2 or like $4 and change back is like carrying a rock in my bag. And like, is that necessary? So that's the upside to going cashless, I think.
Yeah, that's one of them for sure.
Thank you so much for answering our question. Now we're moving on to the open mic section, and this is your opportunity to talk about anything that you're passionate about that doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the floor is yours. Please take it away.
So as you said in the introduction, part of my academic work that I'm really passionate about is to do with education. And what my centre here does at UNSW Sydney is to try and think about what are the interventions we can do in education to help get better outcomes for students in primary school, in secondary school, and in tertiary education. And that's an area which has been pretty advanced in the United States and in Europe over the last 20 years and is still pretty nascent in Australia. And to do that, we need to think really carefully about doing randomized controlled trials. If you want to figure out whether a drug, a pharmaceutical drug, works, what do? Well, you get 200 people and you randomly put 100 of them into a treatment group that get the heart medication, and you put 100 into a control group who get a sugar pill or a placebo. And then you look at the average number of cardiac outcomes in the treatment group and the control group, and that's how effective your heart medication is. That kind of approach to figuring out what works in education has been done overseas for about 2 decades now, and it's still in its early stages or its infancy in Australia. That is how we figure out whether smaller class sizes really help. It turns out they do, but there's this common received wisdom that they don't because people haven't really understood the true causal effect. And so I'm really passionate about that. I spend a chunk of my time doing that stuff, trying to change how we do education research in this country, but most importantly, doing that so we can figure out how to make outcomes better for students.
And where do you see this research going?
I think this research is going to give us a much better understanding of how to spend the resources that we spend on education in a more effective way. I think it's going to make life more rewarding and easier for teachers who I think have an incredibly important and extremely hard job. People who are primary school and secondary school teachers, I think, are heroes and are increasingly asked to do more and more and more with fewer and fewer functional resources. I think we can make their job easier, more rewarding, and fairer, to be honest. And I think we can help students across the spectrum of educational abilities, from the incredibly able who need to be stretched to those who need the most support for a whole variety of reasons. I think we're going to be able to have more targeted, more tailored, more effective education for all of our students. And I think that's going to make things, dramatically better, both from an economic perspective, which is good and it's important. And I'm an economist, so I talk about things like productivity and GDP. But I think also just from a social perspective about human flourishing, we're going to be in a better position, I think, over the next decade or so to understand how we can help people flourish more. And I think that's an incredibly exciting thing.
Absolutely. It sounds like the work that you're doing is incredible. It's paving the way for young people. So that sounds like such good work that you're doing there. Thank you so much for sharing that with us and for all the work in education that you're doing. I can't stress enough how important it is for young people. So thank you for joining us today, sharing some of your wisdom with us, even though you insist that it's not really wisdom. If our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
So you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram, which is @Prof Holden. Or you can go to my website, which is richardholden.org, and you can find out more than you would ever want to find out about the things that I do on there, and see what I continue to be interested in and passionate about.
That's amazing. We'll link those in the show notes. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode. You've been listening to the Self-Improvement Atlas, the Personal Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. For more episodes like this from 10 different life management perspectives, search LMSL on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts so you can get updated on everything we have to offer. We have a wide range of topics readily available for you to check out. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps us grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at pe.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.